Hello and welcome to a webinar by Findhorn Fellows on climate change. My name is Roger Doudna. I live here at Findhorn, a spiritual community and eco-village in northern Scotland that thinks of itself as pioneering a new story for humanity. During my 44 years here, I've had the pleasure of coordinating the Findhorn Foundation Fellowship, a network of more than 150 visionaries and activists with whom we collaborate in this enterprise. I am joined today by three of my favorite Findhorn Fellows, namely those who are working most specifically upon the climate challenge that increasingly dominates and frames our times. They are Albert Bates of the farm community in Tennessee, USA, although Albert is currently in Mexico completing his latest book, and sadly experiencing a weak internet connection, which means that we'll hear him better than we'll see him. Paul Allen from the Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales, UK, where happily there's a good internet connection, and Kosha Joubert, Chief Executive Officer of the Global Ecovillage International, or GEN International, whose headquarters are right across the road here at Findhorn. I had the pleasure of being in Paris 3 years ago with these good people when the Paris Agreement was reached, committing all the world's governments except Syria to limiting global temperature rises to no more than 2 degrees Celsius over the course of this century. This webinar has been occasioned by the more recent climate conferences of the parties, or COPs for short, in both Korea and Poland last fall, around which the latest warnings about global warming were issued, essentially saying that we really need to be even more ambitious and limit temperature rises to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius over the course of this century. They also said that we have really only 12 years to turn our entire civilization around by making a concerted effort to get off fossil fuels, if we are to avert catastrophic and/or runaway climate change. For your information, I am sitting in front of the image that effectively frames the upcoming Climate Change and Consciousness Conference here at Findhorn in April that will also address these concerns. This webinar is meant to acquaint those of you who are watching with the activities of the folks who are here with me virtually today, activities that, in my view, comprise effective antidotes to the gloom that currently surrounds this climate subject. They have all been participants in and contributors to the United Nations climate COPs that have been going on for 26 years now, ever since the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. I'd like to begin by asking my guests to tell us how many of these COPs they've been to, why they've chosen to engage in them, and whether they perceive them to be getting anywhere. Kosha, would you like to begin, please?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just want to say that it's a real joy and honor to be here with you, Roger and Albert and Paul. Great to be here. And yeah, so, you know, I think just to think for a moment about what the United Nations, and especially the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, this really is, you know, where the national governments of our world come together to take stock and agree solutions together, ideally, you know, just the immensity of what the space that we're walking into, you know, with around 20,000, 30,000 real life participants. So these are big events we're going to. And for me, the first one I went to physically was also Copenhagen, just like you, Paul. And we were very involved in the NGO side events as Jen. And that's also where we had our first experience of a great success at COP, because We, of course, as many of us know, this was COP, as we call it, COP 15, so the 15th of these meetings. And it was deeply, deeply disappointing to all the negotiators because they had worked really hard to prepare for agreements, and the agreements didn't go through. The final agreements were of a very, very minimal nature, and people left deeply disappointed and ready to give up. And for Jen, actually, one of those politicians who was from the German Foreign Ministry and just by chance happened on one of our presentations on eco-villages, was so frustrated with the non-results in the official arena that since then, he and I went on to build relationship, and he was inspired to say, you know, actually we need to go radically new ways. And since then, the Global Ecovillage Network has had some small support and funding from the climate funds of the German Foreign Ministry. So that's just, you know, one very concrete outcome for us. But also I think then in the years after, to watch the negotiation skills of Christiana Figueres as the executive secretary of the UNFCCC prepare for Paris, and then to be in Paris and watch. I remember one of my high moments actually in Paris was watching Al Gore present to this enormous room of governmental representatives. And his presentation, it was mind-blowing, and especially on that huge screen, watching images of the effects of climate change on the world, fires, mudslides, ice melting, you know, it's just like so strong, you know. And this was like a 1-hour presentation. Afterwards, I watched the faces of these government representatives, and I could see how this presentation had touched them. That was a moment that touched me. But also, again, doing our presentations, and I think Albert, Paul, we met in Marrakesh, didn't we? Really deeply. But, you know, Albert and I were in some of the Gen presentations together already in Paris, which was COP21, then Marrakesh, then Bonn, this year Katowice, in Poland, COP24. And for Jen, it's been an ongoing conversation. The main area of our work has been an ongoing conversation with government representatives who really are longing to implement what their nations have committed to. But this is not an easy thing. My experience has been that some of the best people in government come to the COP, those that are most concerned about environment, that really want to make a better future for, or want to enable a future for future generations. They come, they often have high ideals, they go back home, and then, you know, they want to protect the forest, but the Ministry of Economy wants to give more licenses to cut down the forest, and it's not an easy thing, you know, to also to work in the local governments. So we've been working with government representatives, especially on the idea of bringing eco-village programs to different nations around the world to help implement SDGs locally and help implement climate actions. Mm-hmm. So to support governments to actually work hand in hand with their populations on large scale change. And this has been a process of relationship building over these years, and we're seeing first fantastic results of that work. There's one more thing I'd like to add. I'm sorry, Roger, but just, you know, what I've also become more aware of over the time is these, you know, because the governments is one part of the negotiation table, but then there's also the interest groups and the constituencies. So women, farmers, and I think one of the great things in the past year has been that there is a real space being created for the indigenous communities and indigenous people. And actually, there is also a space, they're very interested in the voice of local communities. And Jen has just been asked whether we might be able to broker some of that. You know, we do reach out to 10,000 communities worldwide. So would we be able to be one of the players in bringing the voice of local communities to the negotiation tables. And, I don't know, because there is no pay for this. We're a small NGO, how do we actually do this? But yeah, so it's also interesting on that level, being involved. Yeah, maybe that's good for now.
Thanks, Kosha. Albert, you are sort of the grandfather on this issue, at least among Findhorn Fellows, having identified the threat of climate change in your first book in 1989 called Climate in Crisis. How many of these COPs have you been to, and are you satisfied with what they're achieving?
I probably have been to a lot of COPs, but not all of them in person. I like to go ethereally through the internet rather than travel by plane. My first would be back in Rio when they first developed the Framework Convention on Climate Change at the Earth Summit. And I've been to Rio +10 and Rio +20 and the World Summit on Sustainable Development in South Africa and a number of other UN events. And, I've probably been to more COPs by following closely the webinars and live streams and social media, the Twitters and so forth around a COP rather than actually going and attending. And I recommend people do this because it's something anyone can do. You can go now and look at the last COP and see the various different side events and plenaries and so forth. And I started that because, I live in the farm eco-village, and my interest in climate change started in the 1980s. And it led to a book that I wrote in 1989, Climate in Crisis, that described runaway climate change and near-term human extinction. At this point in time, I'm reading David Wallace Wells' The Uninhabitable Earth and Dar Jamal's The End of Ice. And I'm seeing all of this kind of doomer porn really getting out into the thick of it, things that I was actually writing about 35 years ago. But it's clear to me that a lot of the schemes that are being proposed around climate change, like geoengineering, are not going to work. Putting green industry out front is probably not going to work. Natural methods like trees can, but the change we would need to make it would be like changing the operating systems, operating instructions for civilization. It's not like just upgrading your computer to the next version. We actually have to take the time to learn a whole new operating system. And for that reason, I started the Ecovillage Training Center at the farm in 1994. We wanted to know, how do you make a cultural shift to enable us to be around for generations more? And it's not a question being asked at the climate conferences yet. I've taught 50 full permaculture design courses and a number of eco-village design courses, most recently with Kosha in Chengdu, China. And because of like half a century now of experience living in eco-village, and by serving on the governing body and committees on conflict and land management and so forth, I know that humans are difficult creatures to interact with, and that human inertia is the real problem that we have to deal with when we talk about climate change. So what's really needed is a cultural change. And for 35 years, my training center has more than 15,000 graduates in courses like natural building and compost toilets and organic gardening and keyline and management and brewing compost teas. But really what that's about is getting together with people of like mind and coming up and thinking strategically. So you mentioned my new books. I'm just finishing now a book on plastic, but last year I wrote a book that's just coming into the stores called Burn: Using Fire to Cool the Earth. And that describes this concept of putting together the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and the 100 drawdown technologies to make a bioregional, hyper-local biomaterials economy And that's the role played now by eco-villages and permaculture design.
Great, thank you. But can you just explain the concept of drawdown and why you think that's so crucial?
Well, the UN's Nobel Prize winning International Panel on Climate Change, which is thousands of the world's best scientists who work for years developing each report, have come to the conclusion that we need to not just reduce emissions, we have to actually withdraw carbon, legacy carbon, from the atmosphere and also from the oceans, because the oceans is a carbon store and it's in balance with the atmosphere. About, most of the emissions of the past 150 years have gone into the oceans after being a short time in the atmosphere. And as the atmosphere warms and as it has its carbon withdrawn by trees, for instance, or biochar or any other method, what happens is the ocean gives back, it outgasses carbon dioxide to the atmosphere to refill that bucket. So we need to actually withdraw enough to take account for that effect and draw enough out of the oceans at the same time. And that's what drawdown is. Drawdown draws carbon from the atmosphere and from the oceans and tries to get to an equilibrium. The IPCC's latest report suggests that if we want to hold to a maximum of 2-degree warming this century, we need something like a 7-degree decline slope, meaning every single year we have to remove we need to cut our emissions, which means cutting our industrial activity for the large part by 7%. That's half every 10 years. And if you think about it, that's a lot of change, half every 10 years. To hold to 1.5 degrees would be an 11% per year decline slope, which, if we started this back in, say, 2000, we would be on a 2% decline slope. Now we're on a 7 to 11% decline slope. If we wait another 5 years, we'll be on a 15% decline slope. So this is painful, this is difficult. But then you think about it, more than half, most of the emissions that are up in the atmosphere now happened since Seinfeld went off the air. So the first step is to stop putting more up every single year. And after that, then we have to figure out how to take it out.
Thanks, Albert. That's a wonderful introduction. Paul, can you tell us about what your experience has been with these COPs and whether you think they're getting anywhere?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the Center for Alternative Technology has been looking at reshaping the relationship between human beings and technology to make technology work better for the citizen, but within the limits of the planet. And we've been developing zero carbon Britain models for what we actually have to do, how we link up all the different things of food, diet, land use, energy, buildings, transport into one use vision, because we're very keen that we have at least 50% solutions in all of the narratives, because the narratives are very serious and very urgent. And unless we can keep the recognition that we have all the tools and technologies we need, it's hard to keep people motivated. So we've been engaging in many channels, local areas, arts, in councils, citizen activists, schools. But one of the key areas we saw was the climate negotiations. So I first attended presenting at Poznan and Copenhagen, and then Paris, which was pivotal, which was really interesting, presenting with Professor Kevin Anderson, looking at the seriousness of the problem, but also the incredible power of the solutions. But then Marrakesh and Bonn also, because we want to keep the solutions going. And what we've got is a very, very detailed model now. We've been modeling zero carbon Britain since 2007, using 10 years worth of hourly data and two fundamental processes of powering down the amount of energy needed to deliver what society wants, whilst powering up the indigenous clean renewables in Britain. So we feel it's absolutely pivotal as part of the toolkit that allows global society to make the changes that we need to do to show we have all the technologies. And we've been developing relationships with other modelers around the world, and I can talk more about that later. So it's really to ensure that we know we have all the solutions. It's actually a political, psychological, sociological, economic challenge. Not that we need to invent another eco widget or a wind turbine or a battery. We got all that stuff.
So obviously then, it seems to me that what you're saying is that participating in the various COPs has actually helped or been a catalyst for refining your respective scenarios. Is that right?
Absolutely. Whenever we engage with any sector of global society, we listen to what people want more of. And through the COPs, we've understood what people need more detail of to have confidence in the vision. But it's also been a fabulous cross-fertilization, cross-pollinizing exercise to meet other people from other parts of the world doing similar work, comparing the methodologies, comparing the assumptions behind it, comparing the findings, and beginning to build up a network of rapid decarbonization net zero modelers around the world. We're already Skyping with lots across the EU. We've produced a report called Raising Ambition that looks at rapid decarbonisation scenarios for Tanzania or for Los Angeles region, or how the Nordic countries are all planning to collaborate together. So by pulling all of that into one free to download PDF, it means anybody can tour all this good work and realize what a lot of powerful stuff there is out there.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, each of you. I wonder whether you would be happy to share a bit more about what your respective projects actually are and what you think you're contributing to the process.
I work with the GVIX.org, which is the Global Village Institute for Appropriate Technology. It was kind of the basic machine lab that we had at the farm community back in the early 70s. And we have a number of active initiatives, including simultaneously addressing life in the world after petro collapse and financial collapse and extreme climate change, with initiatives like Sail Transport Network, Sail Aegean, Sail Med, and finding ways that we're going to continue the drawdown work after decentralization and steep population declines, which we're going to see this century. I have active projects in India, China, and Palestine, but some of the more interesting ones are prototypes of our eco-regional micro-enterprise biorefinery hub concept that we're calling the Cool Lab. And that's going on now in prototype in the Caribbean, particularly Belize and the Dominican Republic, where we're showing that we can hit sustainable development goals while turning drawdown towards profitable enterprises. Until such time as the internet collapses, we're using blockchain distributed ledgers to organize our regenerative designs and reward investors. We're finding that we can provide electricity at about a third of the cost of wind or solar while making biochar fertilizers from agroforestry and crop waste, which means that the electricity is carbon negative. It's drawing carbon from the atmosphere and banking it. There's also probably, maybe I should make a pitch case here for those who are watching this and have the urge to help. We're making some real progress, and with more adequate funding, we can move farther faster. Ultimately, it's no good to build a fortune in Bitcoin or equities if the planet burns away from your grandchildren. So let's get strategic. And I think one nice thing about the Global Ecovillage Network is it reaches into many different areas of interest to people who want to help. And there are lots of handles that people can connect to and help out. And I hope that more people will consider personally investing in some of this work.
Right. Thank you for that. Very sobering realization. Because drawdown is also the topic of Paul Hawken's recent book, isn't it? And I noticed that he rates biochar something like 72 out of his 100 strategies. And I obviously think your book is in part some way of trying to reanimate or
Yeah, right. I was disputing him. He goaded me into writing that book. And you know, he put out that it was only good for about 1/2 of 1 gigaton, about 500 megatons of carbon removed from the atmosphere between now and mid-century. And I showed in my book how you could withdraw with biochar and biochar technologies 50 gigatons per year. Well, that's against the backdrop of putting now currently 37 gigatons per year into the atmosphere. So we can more than take out what we're putting into the atmosphere every year and draw down that much more almost using biochar. And using it from things like sewage, where we char the sewage, or we char paper mill wastes, or we do other kinds of things like replacing the sand and cement with biochar, which makes the cement stronger, or replacing carbon in plastics with biochar, which gives you carbon fiber, which can be 3D printed. So all of those kinds of ways are ways that we can draw a whole lot more out of the atmosphere than Paul Hawkins imagined was possible.
Okay, so just tell us what biochar actually is as you understand it.
It would have been called charcoal, except you can eat it. That's the only real difference. It's food grade charcoal. And it's essentially taking any biomass source, trees, plants, anything of a biomass photosynthesis source. Crop waste is the obvious one. And putting that into a retort in the absence of oxygen and raising the temperature to about 500 to 700 degrees Celsius. And then what you get out is a pure carbon form of carbon that now will not bond with oxygen to become carbon dioxide. It won't bond with hydrogen very easily. It doesn't get broken down by microbes. It'll be around for 1,000 years. And so it will essentially interrupt, it'll take a timeout from the atmospheric carbon cycle for 1,000 years or longer. And that gives us time to revise our whole method of doing things for civilization. It also provides a soil benefit where it revitalizes soils, which is why it was the terra preta soils of the Indians of the Amazon thousands of years ago. It's like a fertilizer. It provides soil structure.
Well, let's hope your book, Burn, will put Paul Hawken right and hopefully cause a renaissance and resurgence in biochar production.
Thank you. Your words to God's ears.
Thank you. Okay, well, Paul, do you want to say a bit more about how Kat and your respective reports are giving us reasons to be hopeful?
Yeah, I mean, we were surprised that the Paris Agreement targets were more ambitious than many people expected. But we now have to ratchet up ambition, and that isn't just down to the people who gather at the COP every year. It's about having a societal change across all the countries of the world that gives the social license or the pressure on their governments to actually increase the ambition so we can deliver on the Paris goals. So that means opening new conversations at town level, at county level, national, international level. Now, if you're going to have those conversations about something as serious as climate change as it actually is, you have to have a good balance between the problem and the solution, else people will be lost in sort of eco-anxiety. So we feel our work is to pull together what that solution would be like for different countries, and particularly for the UK, to begin pioneering new conversations to show that we can, even though time is tight, we can still do this. And it's not just hapless optimism, it's evidence-based hope. We've got very, very detailed data sets behind it. Our research shows over the past decade, we have all the tools and technologies to create a zero carbon Britain. We can power down the amount of energy we're using by 60% while still delivering society's goals of warm houses, personal mobility, food on the table. And by retrofitting homes, by rethinking public transport, by looking at examples where these things have actually happened in real life, we can begin to bring it to life. And once we bring it to life in our heads, we can then begin to bring it to life in our hearts and in the world. At the same time as powering down energy demand, we can power up clean energy. I mean, Britain is a wind-swept island. There is easily enough energy hits the world every year to power human needs. We just need to design systems that can capture that flow of energy rather than rely on buried fossil fuels. Now, I absolutely agree with Albert as well. We need negative processes. Even if we do everything we need to do, insulate all the buildings, get people on better transport systems, 100% renewables, there's still some emissions that we have to balance out by revitalizing natural climate solutions, by increasing forestation, by revitalizing peat bogs, by getting natural systems to function better, and then we can begin to draw down the excess carbon out of the atmosphere. The interesting thing about our work is we're also looking at what are the multi-solving opportunities of doing this? What are the health benefits of cleaner air, or more active citizens, or more balanced diets? Or what are the economic effects of reduced healthcare bills, or reduced energy costs to better insulated houses? If we actually look at it, it's one of the most exciting transitions that human society could possibly ever make. And by the way, it solves the climate problem as well. So beginning to paint a picture of it, and that's why we're very deeply involved with arts. We've had Radio 4 afternoon theatre plays, we've been in the National Theatre, the Royal Opera House, bringing these sorts of visions to life, because once people can imagine themselves there, and we run exercises like Postcards from the Future, where you imagine yourself actually in the world that we're all trying to create, and what conversations are going on, what might happen around Christmas, or what might happen around Valentine's Day. Once people imagine themselves in it, it empowers them to want to make it actually happen. So we do a lot of that work around towns, cities, and councils, and it's really, really exciting at the moment. The number of towns and cities and councils across the UK and across the English-speaking and across the world that are declaring a climate emergency and making a plan to get to zero by 2038 for Manchester, 2030 for many, 2028 for Nottingham, which is one of the most ambitious. Once these climate emergencies are declared, it opens new conversations. And the interesting thing is so many of them are actually declared unanimously, when people think, oh, I didn't expect those councillors to declare, but many more people get this than we think get it. Currently, well, 1st of February, the calculation was there was 12.6 million people in the UK living in a council area or a city that had declared a climate emergency. When I last looked, it had gone up to 14 million. There's 27 million people in 4 English-speaking countries across the world, and there's an awful lot of climate emergency declarations in the pipeline. So all of this is like it's an incredible shift. It's happening faster than even we expected it to do. And climate change is a serious problem because the problem itself contains feedbacks that feed back on itself, that make it get worse faster. The reason it's an emergency is because governments haven't acted fast enough. But there's another feedback happening now at citizen level, where people are hearing about what other cities have done. They're making their own declarations. We got our own town council of Machynlleth to declare a climate emergency. We're now in the middle of a 6-month consultation period across the town, looking at how we can power down and power up. When that happened, the county level, which is much bigger than us, the whole of Powys County, has also declared an emergency. All the other councils around are now listening. We're talking with the mayor of Aberystwyth, and when a town is twinned with 3 other towns, as towns do, the mayor can then ring up the other mayors and say, we've just declared a climate emergency, why don't you in Germany or in Brittany also declare climate emergency? So we're seeing a sort of, another sort of exponential curve happening, but it's one of people declaring an intent to solve this, which is really heartening.
Thanks, Paul. Kosha, can you tell us a bit more about what you see Jen contributing to this process?
Oh, it's been heartening listening to Albert and Paul. And, Albert, I think, is already expressing, in being a co-founder also of the Farm Ecovillage in the US, is expressing how this awareness about the impact we are having as human civilization, the Anthropocene that we're finding ourselves in, where as humans we're shaping the reality on Earth, that this is also what lies behind the Global Ecovillage Network, and moved people to say, look, we're currently living a story of a destructive presence on the planet by the human race. And that goes completely against the grain of what Indigenous people have said we are here for, which is to protect, to be guardians of the life systems on the planet, to protect and defend what is sacred around us, the systems of life. And, I think it's to recognize that there's also partly, it's really the Western mindset that has imposed this kind of industrialization, this kind of profit-seeking, control-seeking, security-seeking, expansive economic development that has spread to all corners of the planet today. And where we see that those countries who have contributed least to the issues are currently suffering most, or first, from the effects. So all of these are things that we are witnessing through our communities in the Global Ecovillage Network, but also where the communities have grown from the seeds of wanting to make a holistic change. Because as far as I'm concerned, climate change is just one expression of the problem. We're currently living in a world where I believe 1% of the richest people on the earth currently own already more than 50% of the world's resources, a world where every day 24,000 people, most of them children, die of hunger, a world where every day 200 species pass from the world forever. It's like climate change is one expression of a civilization that has gone weirdly wrong, and where we are really invited to completely wake up. As both Albert and Paul have already said, we're not speaking about a soft transition. We're speaking about a complete transformation of the human presence on the planet, and a complete transformation of our understanding of what we are here for, what we are meant to do. And I think what Jen brings to the puzzle is examples of where the solution is already being lived, places that people like you and I can go to, we can visit, we can taste, we can smell, we can see, we can touch how people are living that are bringing down their ecological footprints to say 30% of the national average, their carbon footprints to say 60% of the 40%, 30% of the national average. And we can actually visit these places and notice that this is not places of suffering, but places, as I like to call them, places of luxurious simplicity, where we actually live richer lives in so many ways. I can say that as a young mother, being able to live in a place where I realize, where I know, not only do I bring up my children in a community where they can explore life in such a healthy way, where I know where our food comes from, where our energy comes from, where our water comes from. And I know that I'm not, that I'm working towards creating a possibility for my children and their children to have a future, And so yes, there is that example showcasing what we can do as humans, how we can create human settlements as hubs of regeneration of life instead of hubs of destructive behaviors. And people are so hungry for good examples. Also, I think the Global Ecovillage Network is bringing to the table examples of collaboration across all cultures and continents, of people of integrity. So when we show up at the COP and we have a group of people where we have our representatives from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, Europe, USA, all taking the platform together and sharing, it's very touching for people to see that, very inspiring. It's something that we're hungry for, true collaboration across the globe, you know, understanding that climate doesn't stop at any borders. We're in this together, for better or worse. And then bringing out this inspiration, you know, because it still feels like so many governments, so many initiatives work on the one big solution or on very top-down approaches. And I'm a believer in the fact that one of the most underutilized resources we currently have on this planet is the good intentions of citizens, you know, and that part of the shift, the complete and utter transformation of human presence, is to believe again in the human ability to love, to care, to regenerate. And our good intentions, our wish to be part of the solutions is a very strong force in all of this. And I believe the kind of solutions that we need, you know, however we combine them, needs to be spread also in a small is beautiful, but because it's so many of us, it becomes the whole way. And we're currently really working on that in different ways. On the one hand, working on the Ecovillage impact assessment, really measuring the results of ecovillages worldwide. We have first results, but we're currently working with several universities on a scientific level where we'll have results for the first 100 communities by the end of this year. But also using gaming approaches where we inspire youth to get involved. You know, Greta Thunberg is having a huge effect. You know, the youth are standing up saying, you cannot continue like this, you know, and we need to work with that, where this is also, it's really important to bring the work with the information technology, with the online games, but bring that into, from virtual to real reality, and allow a gaming approach to be part of the transformation. Yeah, working with governments, as I said before, on regional and national implementation of ecovillage development programs. So bringing this belief that yes, we can work with the communities, community-led change. And lastly, I think for Jen, it's been super exciting to host our first online summit just a few weeks ago, from the 1st to the 10th of February, where we had more than 10,000 participants, 145 hubs around the world. And just sharing information and inspiration, both from leading edge thinkers around the world, but also then inviting people to start building community around these topics where they are, and start taking action where they are. And we're really excited to continue using these tools to help, as you know, one part of a much bigger global movement, but to really help this movement move forward and understand that we need a shift in consciousness. We need a shift in how we understand our presence on Earth, and a shift in who we feel we are on this planet. And I think that's actually, it's fun to wake up.
Thanks, Kosha, for that wonderful overview of Jen's work and activity at the UN COPs. I'd also like to take this opportunity to commend you on Jen's recent online community summit, in which some 30 speakers addressed their climate concerns, about half of whom were Findhorn Fellows, I'm happy to say. You mentioned Greta Thunberg, this young Swedish student who has been lobbying the Swedish parliament to step up their response to climate change in a manner commensurate with the threat. Her example has since been emulated by countless young people across the world demanding action from their governments. She's also been featured at several recent UN events, where she has challenged governments to pull their fingers out and get on with addressing the climate challenge. Explicitly, she says it's time to panic and act in response to the increasingly immediate threat of runaway climate change. Do you agree that it's time to panic, or would that be counterproductive? Will humanity awaken and/or respond in time to avert catastrophic climate change?
I will take that on because I'm currently reading David Wallace Wells' The Uninhabitable Earth. And he's doing a lot of interviews as he's putting his book out into the world. And he gets asked this question a lot. Why are you engaged in such a strong amount of fear mongering? And is the panic effect going to really have any good value, or is it just going to kind of chill the colloid and make us all freeze up and think somebody else should deal with this? It's not for me. And in actuality, he says, we need that moment. We need the reality check. And there's a lawsuit going on in the Western U.S. right now where a group of young people are suing the government, several governments, state and federal, over climate change and how they have been deprived of their future. And the judge in the cases, there's a couple cases, the judges have consistently ruled on the side of the children to keep their standing in court, where the government has come in and said, no, you shouldn't, you don't have any rights to be here, you're too young. And the judge has said, no, they're not, that they actually are suing because the politicians elected by their parents failed to protect them. And that they have a right to say their piece here. And that actually it's important that we listen and we do something to remedy the situation, because it's clear that the parents have failed in their duty, the parent generations. I remember when I was a young attorney arguing environmental cases, and I would raise issues about transgenerational rights, but they were always very in the abstract. Future generations will be damaged by nuclear power, or future generations will have chemical waste from our generation. That's always very abstract. Now you have, with Greta Thunberg and the school movement, Extinction Rebellion and others, people coming forward from those generations in real time. This is one of the great things about getting to live this long, is I get to see these next generations coming up and doing what I had predicted they would do, which is to get angry about it. And I think that there's an important relevance to that anger, and that it actually should be encouraged.
Thank you, Albert. Paul, you want to weigh in?
I think it's important that we wake up. Panic isn't necessarily the best option for long-term action, even though we might go through a period of panic when we realize just how tight the timeline is. But more and more people see it in their yards, in their back gardens, in their towns, in their areas. Today there are forest fires raging in the UK in February, which is just completely unheard of. We see the documentaries about the incredibly serious impacts around the world, but then as we continue viewing our normal 2D box set friends of all of the programs we watch, the characters never take any of the actions that we know we need to take. They never talk about it. So it creates a huge bubble in which the majority of society exists, where nobody's talking about it, nobody's doing anything about it. And also every time the contemporary culture looks ahead, 5, 10, 15, 25 years, it's always ecological collapse and zombie-filled ruins. We never see a drama of human interaction set against a world where we've actually solved this problem. So in order to help people wake up, we need to be able to take people there and show them that this is doable and this is a better world. And increasingly, we're excited at the number of people who are waking up, taking action within the sphere that they have more control of, local, petitioning their councils, changing them. Green open homes, 600 homes have had 10,000 people through, showing how you can retrofit a home to a very high standard. All sorts of things are happening on a citizen level, and it's feeding back on itself. We just need to keep the pressure up and keep supporting people. That's why at the Centre for Alternative Technology, we train people up to postgraduate level in all the skills they need to be change makers. And even though it's academically robust and verified by universities, we actually get people out there touching real wood, real soil, really doing stuff with their hands, and we can see that that has an emotional, empowering effect. Or we have short courses where people will come to Machantlath for a weekend and learn how to do something that then will take back to their communities. And it's empowering these change makers, and we need more centers like this where people can actually do stuff and realize that other people think like they do. Because probably one of the most important things to realize is 74% of the people care. They hold intrinsic values of social work, environmental work. But when surveyed, they find 77% of their people think that their neighbors don't care because of all of the messaging that's going on about consumerism. But once you start doing stuff, you meet other people who are doing stuff, and you realize that people around you think very much like you do, and they do care.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Kosha?
Yeah, beautiful. I appreciated listening to that, Paul and Albert. Yeah, and I find the concept of pre-traumatic response really interesting. That some people are saying that that's part of what we're seeing now. And, you know, it's something that you see before soldiers go to war, that they show a pre-traumatic response. It's like they're creating premonition. And I think part of the freeze that we're seeing is already part of that. So, you know, my sense from reading the field is that there is enough panic around as it is. There's enough anxiety coursing through people. There's enough adrenaline in people. I don't think that's what we need. You know, there is what I do feel is that people are far too isolated with the information they receive, and they cannot process it. They cannot integrate it. So, you know, people are reading, we're all bombarded by information through the internet, through the news. But often it comes in on the rational level here, and it's kind of minimally processed, and it kind of gets stuck. You know, I feel like when I speak about waking up to who we are meant to be, I feel like we have a lack of processing the feedback from the world in a way that leads to manifestation, to change. We have a lack of, when I was speaking to Rob Hopkins, he was speaking about the need for ministers of imagination and bringing imagination back into the school system. You know, we've just spent a century, more than a century, educating children to prepare them for often passive work in the economy. And now we need to really rethink education. How do we create an education that allows all of us, you know, also speaking about lifelong education, that allows us to find out who we are, what is a specific piece that I have to bring to the puzzle, what is my purpose for being here, and fulfilling that in the face of the information we receive, and allowing that information to go beyond our minds to our hearts, to our, you know, really into our navigation system, so that our inner compass can tell us what the next steps are for us to do. And I find that when people get support, as both my colleagues here have said, you know, if we can give people support to find pathways, to find possibilities, just to set them on a different path from hopelessness to, wow, maybe I can do something. Maybe I can be part of the solution. Just that turn can unleash an enormous energy, because what I see is just the intelligence of people is enormous. And if we start collaborating and really listening to the information that is out there in the field, I think personally, I have a deep trust that we can find incredible solutions that we don't even yet know about, you know, and what Albert just mentioned, you know, how Paul Hawken thought this about biochar, and already Albert can show this, you know, completely different size of solution that is possible there. And the same is true in many other arenas. So I think that switch to put us from passive, complaining, hopelessness, depression, drug use, consumerist behaviors, to try and, you know, sitting and watching Netflix every evening, to kind of have to blend out and just survive because I have so much anxiety in my system, to a really co-creative, you know, let's do this. What are we going to do? Take the first step, the next step, you know, and build community around you. Yeah, there is an unleashing of human creativity and human intelligence, human love and care that is waiting to happen in my eyes. So that's also why we call the online summit the power of community. I think the power of community, stepping out of isolation with these issues into meaningful conversations that are the start of meaningful action. This is not something we're meant to do alone. It's at the key around climate change and all these other issues is to move from isolation and control to collaboration, co-creation, imagination. Over to you, Albert.
Yeah, I want to follow up on something that Kosha just said, because over these last few years, this is something Daniel Vall noticed. We've changed the conversation at the COPs, in the corridors of power. Small numbers of people like you and me and, you know, Paul and Kosha and myself have actually had an effect that if you go to the UN climate summits back in Paris or Marrakesh or Bonn before 2018, the main words being used to describe the way out of the problem were things like adaptation and mitigation. But in Katowice in 2018, the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, for the first time, adopted the words of Project Drawdown and the International Biochar Initiative and the Commonwealth of Nations, and began speaking of reversing climate change. And with that shift of language, the studies of negative emissions like natural climate geotherapies, agroforestry, permaculture, biochar, aquaculture, suddenly moved from off stage to stage center. And while we can't know if humans have, you know, the wherewithal, the collective capacity to act quickly enough to actually make the change that needs to happen, what can be said is that a small number of activists in the eco-village and bioregional and transition towns and permaculture worlds have already changed the conversation. We've already changed it that much in a very short amount of time. And so just imagine as we build our strengths and we continue to put these pressures onto the leaders of the world, how fast we can continue. And that's just what I want to contribute.
Yeah, I think I would add to that. I agree. It's not really what's being said, it's who's saying it. Is the messages are moving from the radical thinkers into the mainstream. We produced a report 6 years ago, People, Place and Planet, looking at how shifting diet could be better for individuals and also for the planet, and how the two things balance. And that's been reiterated by the Lancet. You know, the mainstream people are saying this. They recognize that it needs to change. It just needs linking up. The top down and the bottom up need to come together and shake hands on it.
Yeah, and so it just reminds me, Paul, I think I had my first conversation about this with you in Marrakesh, but about the faith-based movements and communities, you know, and one of the people I interviewed was Reverend Fletcher, an Anglican priest from the US who leads the Green Faith movement. But, you know, just these are movements that haven't even been seen much, you know, but as a strong player, but they reach out to is it like 70% of the world's population or more that see themselves as part of one of the big world's religions, and to also speak to the world through religious leaders, faith leaders that are showing how we can change lifestyles. You know, that's also where suddenly they're having a day of plant-based diet every day and across churches in Zimbabwe. You know, it's super interesting stuff that is happening through avenues that we hadn't thought of before, I find. So just really agreeing with that. Who's speaking about this today and how much that's shifted, and how much, you know, also coming from 20 years ago, that the words we were using in the Global Ecovillage Network are now all being used in the mainstream, and how fast that shift is happening. Yeah.
And even though we have a very tight timeline, we have to recognize we haven't got much time to do this. We've got to recognize that the cultural shifts we've seen in the past haven't been linear. We've had shifts about class, race, gender, LGBT that have happened up until a trigger point, a crucial few trigger points, and then things change. So we get the leader of the Conservative Party saying, I support same-sex marriage in the UK, where just a few years before it was illegal. So this non-linearity of the cultural shift, the feedbacks, is what gives me hope and what makes me keep pushing every day. And if everybody can get behind it, I think we can do it. But it's got to be based around a positive vision to balance the seriousness, particularly for the new audiences that we were just reaching.
Well, I would certainly like to thank you all for the sense of hope that you have inspired in me, and I hope also in our viewers. But before we end, I think that I would like to ask the obvious bottom line question, and that is, what do you think that we as individuals can do? I mean, you've spoken effectively about how you see the shift happening perhaps in the greater scheme of things, but what would you have to say to individuals about what they can do, how they can be a part of the process?
You would have to say that that's kind of very specific to an individual and what kind of situation they are in. And I think more and more people are coming to a realization that this is the time to act. You know, personally, I feel like our hopes are probably better placed with the next life form that comes along than with humans, because I think humans are toast. But if there's just a 1% chance on that thin thread of hope, I can do no less than to pursue it. I'm genetically wired. We try to help our kind, you know, to survive. We're survival-oriented, two-legged people, you know? And so everybody has this moment of, what can I do to help us survive? And they're going to apply that in the particular context of what kind of work they do, what kind of art they perform, what kind of child-rearing practices they have. All of those are going to come into play as people begin to address how they can play a role in making the change, and we all will.
For me, I think there's two fundamental processes going on that are deeply entwined with each other. One is the essential no to things that we know are wrong, future investments in more coal production or fracking. We have to stand and hold the line and say no to the things that are wrong, but we also, as individuals, have to say yes to the things that we believe in, the things that are right, by having more fun, by having more exciting lives on lower carbon, by walking more, by quitting flying, by balancing your diet and eating less meat and getting your house into an energy efficient position, just looking at your life and what are the things that I can do. And in doing that, I think the important thing is not to see yourself as an isolated individual, because I think that's a slightly wrong way of looking at it. We can't just say, here's your top 10 tips for things you have to do to be greener. We have to look at the whole system around us and how that's compelling us to do the wrong things through advertising and subsidies and externalized costs that nobody pays. We have to have a systemic shift as well as the individual shift, and get the two things working together to say yes to what we want to see and no to what we know we have to stop.
Yeah, somehow I'm reminded of the quote by Marianne Williamson that Nelson Mandela used, and I can't quote it correctly now, but just this, you know, our real fear is not that we're small, but that we are powerful beyond measure. And, you know, I think it's time to take stock, like for each of us to sit down and think, what am I doing with this life right now? Where in my life am I not congruent with my heart, with my integrity? You know, where am I sticking to old habits because it makes me feel safe? And am I courageous to let go and to become more true to myself? You know, and that's the only way we're at this time, you know, we're, as far as I'm concerned, where true happiness lies, you know, in following that inner line that is calling us forth. So I think it's what the world is asking of us, is to take stock and to start believing in our possibility, our potential, our greatness also, and take that step. I was so touched by the interview with Polly Higgins and hearing from her how she started studying law and now is bringing CEOs from Shell and the Minister of Environment from Holland to the International Court of Justice in The Hague to bring justice, to ask them, how could you continue with business as usual? Not only that, but actually veil the reality of climate change in order to continue making profit. You know, how could you give them the blessing to continue doing that as a minister? You know, how could you? And bringing that in front of the court. And this is one woman standing up and following her inner calling. So, you know, what happens if all of us stand up to what we know in our hearts we're here to do? Yeah, and that can look wildly different, but I think it's time to take stock.
Well, here we are at the end of our proceedings, and I really just have to say again how much I appreciate each of you and your contributions, and indeed the kind of effects that you're beginning to have, and how much grounds for hope you have hopefully shared with myself and our audience today. So once again, thanks so much.